STAARS Plus research presentations. STAARS Plus is one of the key research platforms for PRCI. We're delighted to have been able to partner with Cornell and with Chris Barrett in this program for the kind of the really cutting edge capacity building around research that takes place under it. So I want to thank, first of all, then all of you researchers for the persistence and the dedication and the commitment that you've shown over the past over 1 year. You've done this under very difficult circumstances. We know that. We really appreciate it, and we know it was not always easy. I want to thank the mentors from Cornell and from Syracuse University, I believe, and perhaps from IFPRI as well. Without the mentors and without your dedication, this would also be impossible. And finally, I really want to thank Chris Barrett. Chris is the driving force behind this program and sets a fantastic example by providing timely and spot-on feedback, detailed, timely, spot-on feedback to all of your papers, multiple versions of the papers as they come out. So thank you, Chris, for conceiving this program, and thank you for joining us, Michigan State, and others in PRCI in doing this. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Chris. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dave. Let me just say a couple of brief words about the STAARS Plus program before we launch into the presentations, which are the real purpose today. STAARS Plus is a new program thanks to USAID funding through the PRCI Innovation Lab that Dave directs out of Michigan State. And emblematic of that collaboration between Michigan State, IFPRI, and Cornell, the mentors for this first cohort of 4 teams come from all 3 institutions. So I echo Dave's thanks to the mentors that have worked so closely and productively with these 4 teams to generate really exciting policy relevant research that I hope you will enjoy listening to. STAARS Plus is intended to help teams at policy research institutes in sub-Saharan Africa, and with the new upcoming second cohort, also South and Southeast Asia, to teams of 2 or 3 young researchers from policy research institutes in those places to work closely with research mentors at Cornell, IFPRI, and Michigan State to develop high quality publishable manuscripts to build their network and to undertake professional development training of a variety of sorts. So this is building on the related STAARS program for individual researchers, with the key distinctions that STAARS Plus is for teams, and with this next cohort is also open to South and Southeast Asian scholars. We're very excited to present today the 4 first cohort teams presenting the current versions of the papers they have produced with their mentors. Let me just emphasize to those of you who are listening, who are thinking about applying or encouraging your colleagues and network members to apply for the second cohort, the closing date for applications for cohort 2 for STAARS Plus is August 15th. So you have a bit over 2 weeks still to make your applications. Details on that are available on the PRCI Innovation Lab website, as well as the STAARS website at Cornell. So with no further ado, I'm really excited to introduce the first team, which it will be presented by Marcel Zitoule from the African School of Economics in Benin. So over to you, Marcel.
Thank Chris for this introduction. I will start sharing our work at AAC. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So the AAC team is working on a geometric analysis of agricultural productivity and technological heterogeneity evidence from Tanzania. In the team, we have Karim Nchari from AAC, myself, and Yanyan Liu and Heidi Kela as mentors. What motivates this paper is that we notice that in sub-Saharan African countries, agriculture is the main sector people living off. To achieve a sustainable development, reduce poverty, and enhance the living standards, it is critical to improve agricultural productivity. Although there are some improvements, we still notice that the sub-Saharan African agricultural productivity is still growing at the approximately the average of the rate of developed countries. And recent studies have demonstrated the heterogeneity of the small production environment and technology in sub-Saharan Africa. We can cite in this literature Goli and Udry in 2021. Moore and co-authors established that about half of the dispersion we are talking about can be accounted for by measurement errors in the output. After correcting for these measurement errors, they find that dispersion in productivity among farms is significant and persistent over time. Results in the Goli and Udry paper and the Moore and co-authors papers question the common implication of observed dispersion, such as the importance of misallocation of factors. And Goli and Udry suggest that the potential for efficiency gain through the reallocation of land among farmers and farm may be relatively modest. There is an increasing recognition that the heterogeneity of agroecologies and farmers' techniques need locally adapted solution and tailored approach. So we want to have measures of productivity, agricultural productivity that account for farmers' technical heterogeneity. For this, some solutions have been proposed in the literature, but they are meant to measure agricultural efficiency. So we can cite the stochastic frontier analysis, but it imposes a hypothesis on the functional form, the input substitutions, and the distribution of the unobserved heterogeneity. We also have the data envelopment approaches, which doesn't really have these assumptions, but which also is a non-parametric approach. The goal of this paper is to use a geometric approach to production analysis in order to measure the productivity change over time while accounting for farms' heterogeneity over several dimensions. In fact, we can notice that farms are characterized by variable soil characteristics, variable access to farming resources, different production objectives, and varying capacities to absorb risk inherent to alternative management practices, and also diverse attitude toward farming and the role farming plays within the overall livelihood. The second step of this, the second goal of this paper is also to find the factor influencing productivity for heterogeneous farms. In this paper, we are using a two-step analysis. We know that using maize quantity technology, resources, and allocation. So to deal with this heterogeneity, we are applying the geometric approach. In the first step, then, we have the quantity maize harvested as a function
Marcel, I think we may have lost your audio.
And use in the regression where we have as a regressor the plot characteristics, the manager characteristics, the household characteristics, and the community level characteristics. In this paper, when we control for zone specific year-fixed effect and we cluster the standard errors at the village level, the results suggest that higher productivity is associated with higher number of plots, good average soil quality, and the quantity of inorganic fertilizer used. Alternatively, it tends to have a lower productivity. Alternatively, it tends to have lower productivity when it is associated with plot managers' age, the total length size and the steepness of the line and the higher length of growing degree days. There are two main contributions in this paper. First, we have a methodological contribution as we're introducing in the agroecon literature a new approach to investigate agricultural productivity. And the second is empirical, as we provide a rigorous measure of productivity while accounting for farm heterogeneity and use these measures to identify the features correlated with agricultural productivity in Tanzania. We're using in this paper LSMSISA data from Tanzania, and the data is made up of 4 rounds, 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2014. And we have data on all the plots cultivated by the household, the members of the household that farm the plots, the input used and the output harvested, as well as the household and community level characteristics. In this paper, we solely focus on pure stand maize plots, and after adjustment for outliers, the final sample size is 2,656 pure stand plots. We are working at the plot level. In the table 1 here, we have the descriptive statistic. I'm only going to comment some of these statistics. For instance, we know that compared to people that have bad soil quality, people that we have about 46% of the people of the plot that have good qualities, and compared to the people that have the plots that have average bad quality, average quality account for 47% in the data. We also see that about 23% of the plots in our data are managed by females. In the following, I'm going to describe how we use the geometric approach in order to compute the productivity index. In this framework, the post technology of a farm is equal to a vector. And basically, a farm is using a given amount of input to produce an output, which is in our case is the pure stand maize that farms are producing. Then the short run possibilities of an agricultural sector in Tanzania is represented by a set of a vector of production activities, and the short run total production associated with this set is represented by the zonotype, which is basically a Minkowski sum of the segment line represented by the vectors. I'm going to quickly break it down using an example. Here we have 4 vectors in our sector. So 4 farmers or 4 plots on which we are growing pure stand maize. So what happened is that the algorithm compute the sum of these vectors 2 by 2, and when it reaches all the vectors, we have a solid that looks like that, which we call a zonotype. 2 main things are interesting in this solid is the shape, the general shape that provides an indication of the heterogeneity, but also the segment linking this origin to the opposite vertex, which is called the main diagonal of the zonotype. So we're going to compute interesting outcome based on both of them. So Dozy and Now in 2016 define heterogeneity as a Gini volume, and it is a normalized ratio of the volume of the zonotype I just presented over the volume of the parallelotype. The parallelotype is here the smallest parallelotype that is made up with the diagonal line that I talked about. And basically the Gini volume is computed taking the volume of the zonotype divided by the volume of the whole parallelotype. When we compute the sum of all the inputs and outputs, we have this diagonal line, And this diagonal line will tell us something about the productivity. But before, let's briefly talk about, come back to the heterogeneity. We have two extreme cases in this framework. The first case is when the heterogeneity is, the Gini coefficient is equal to 0, which is the case where everybody, every product, every farmers are using the same technology in the data. And the second case is where the Gini value is equal to 1, where is equal to 1, where basically some of these firms have input but have a high quantity of input but low quantity, extremely low quantity of output, or conversely, where they have a high output with extremely low quantity of input. The measure of the productivity for a given industry, Y, with n production unit, is given by the tangent angle formed by the main diagonal line with the input space. So basically what we have our main diagonal line, and the tangent of the angle that this diagonal line is making with the input space give us an indication of the productivity of the firm, of the sector. So for a firm specific productivity, we still take this vector representing the firm, and the angle, the tangent of the angle that this vector firm is forming with the input space is giving an indication of the measure of productivity. So the measure of productivity of a farm with the technology AI is given, as I said, by the tangent of the angle formed by a vector with the input space, and the measure of heterogeneity of a farm is given by the volume of the zonotope. The implementation of the zonotope of the geometric approach is done by the zonotope starter package developed by Marco Cocchioni. Okay. So in the first step, what we have is basically that we compute heterogeneity and productivity, but we can see that for almost all the, we also work on at zone level, and for almost all the zone, when productivity increases, heterogeneity decreases, and when productivity decreases, heterogeneity increases. We also notice the same pattern when we compute the labor intensity, which is the relative intensity of labor regarding the line, the use of the line. And when productivity increases, the labor intensity also increases. In the second step, we're using fixed effect regressions, and here I'm only projecting the result of the last specification, which is the full specification with plot, manager, household, and community characteristics. So quickly, we can see that only, some of these variables are really correlated with the productivity index, such as the quality of the soil, but also the use of the seeds and the age of the manager. For robustness check, we compare the productivity index to the Malmquist index obtained by applying the DA analysis to our data. So basically, we also use DA analysis and compare the productivity index with the DA analysis. So this is the first step of the robustness check, and to see whether our analysis is sensible to measurement errors. We also go through the same step, geometric approach and OLS regression, using now self-reported lane size and GPS lane size. So the result of the first is given there, and basically when we have increase in productivity, we also have increase in the Malmquist coefficients. Here is the log of the productivity and the log of the coefficient from the DE approach, and we can see a kind of symmetry, although the magnitude are not the same, a kind of symmetry regarding those distributions. For robustness check, we also, as I said, we computed the coefficient for the self-report in the GPS, and we observed that the coefficients that are significant are not sensitively different from each other. And for the productivity index, we also realized that they really look alike, because here we have the productivity index computed with the GPS and the productivity index computed with the self-reported, but still they really match each other. So to sum it up quickly, in this work, we introduced a new approach to farm production analysis that accounts for each farm individual technological heterogeneity. And the obtained farm level measures of productivity is then used as a dependent variable in fixed effect regression analysis. At the end of this presentation, thank you for following, and your questions, comments are all welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel, for a fascinating and really interesting presentation, and for modeling such great presentation skills. Finished 20 seconds ahead of allotted time. Very impressive. I wish most of my faculty colleagues and I could do the same. So we now move on to the next presentation, which will be by Fatou Faye from the Bureau d'Analyse Macroéconomique in Senegal. Over to you, Fatou.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to present to you our paper on the analysis of rice demand in Senegal, which is quoted by me, myself, Ami Faye from ZEF, Rasoul from FAO. They are former BAM colleagues, and our mentors, Min Lee and John McPeak. And what motivates this paper is the importance of rice worldwide, because along with wheat and corn, rice is one of the 3 major crops that are cultivated worldwide. And in developing countries, it plays an important role in achieving food security, but also political stability. For example, in 2018, the global consumption of rice was estimated at more than 400 million tons. And in sub-Saharan Africa, also, rice is very important, and it plays an important role in food security, both in urban and rural areas. Again, in 2018, global rice, 31% of global rice exports went to Africa. And here we see a graph which shows the evolution of rice imports from 1992 to 2017. And first we see that the share of imports going to Africa are increasing during this period. And in 2017, 56% of all rice imports were from West Africa. And the main countries where we import rice are Thailand, Vietnam, and India. And in West Africa, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Senegal are the top import-dependent countries. And given this dependency to importations, these countries are implementing policy to reduce this dependency, because this has consequences on our trade balances, but also it increases our vulnerability to price shocks. For example, in Senegal, there are some policies to restrict foreign competition through import quotas. For example, since 2015, our government has implemented import quotas to rice importators. So to sell imported rice, they have also to sell some amount of local rice. And also in 2017, our government implemented an import ban on 2 rice types, whole grain and semi-broken rice. Also, there are some policies to increase domestic production via many projects like PNAR and PRACAS, which aim to increase local rice production through major investments in the Senegal River Valley, but also in the rain-fed areas. However, despite these policies and these programs, we still see that rice imports are increasing. And we think that this is because mainly our government are implementing supply side measures. And while implementing these measures, they assume that local and imported rice are substitutes. And in the literature, we know that the demand is also important for policy to be more effective and have the objective. And what we see is that we need evidence on the substitutability between local and imported rice. And to have this evidence, we need to do a careful demand analysis. However, we have seen that there are few studies of rice consumption which use national representative data in Africa. Many studies are made in Asia, and in Africa, many authors worked in data from Nigeria. And for example, in the case of Senegal, we lack evidence on the demand side because we have many studies on preferences, but not on elasticities, on substitutability. And particularly, we lack evidence on both urban and rural households. Also, in the studies that have been done, special aspects are not sufficiently investigated. And so in this paper, we aim to analyze demand feature to inform public decisions. And in this analysis, what we will do is to study the substitutability of local and imported rice and to compute income and price elasticities. And in this paper, we are going to use the QUEDS model. Now I give the floor to my colleague Rasool.
Thank you, Fatou. And to answer to these questions that Fatou raised, we've been using data that were collected under the Agricultural Policy Support Project, PAPA, between 2015 and 2019. And we were ourselves, all three, involved in these data that we monitored to some extent. And we have a sample of nearly 6,400 households from 2 different surveys, but they have been collected nearly like in 2017 and 2018, but they have been collecting during the same period of these 2 years. The urban sample is nearly 2,000 households, and the rural sample is around 4,000 households, mainly in rain-fed areas. But for the urban sample, we are almost representative of all major Senegalese cities. In terms of sampling strategy, we have been using a 2-stage sampling, random sampling, the primary units being the enumerators areas, and the secondary units are the households that are actually drawn from the first stage in the enumeration areas that are selected. And this sampling strategy has allowed us to have sample weights for all observations in the data set. Next slide, please. Fatou? Okay. Okay, and our data, as I was saying, in terms of urban data, it is nationally representative. While for the rural data, we have to account for some missing agroecological zones that are Nyai and Senegal River Valley. And as a consequence, we may be actually underestimating the consumption of own produced rice and fruits and vegetables. And in terms of spatial variability, given the context, we have classified urban households into different types of cities, as you know, major cities versus secondary cities, as while for the rural households, they are treated as one group. In terms of empirical strategy, we have been actually estimating expenditures and price elasticities that are actually coming from a QUEDS model. As you know, QUEDS is an extension of the AIDS model, and it is part of the family of Piglock demand models. And what we like about this model is that it actually allowed for non-linearity of angle curves. And it helps us account for the potential quadratic form of the angle curve behavior for some durable and luxury goods. Next slide, please. And in terms of still in the empirical strategy, we have computed like household food expenditures for all food items, but we have classified these food items into 8 categories. Most of them are defined by according to the nutritional status of the food groups, especially citing the different papers such as Saweda and al. 2020 and others. But we have taken into account the fact that we are focusing on rice. That's why we broke it down into local rice and imported rice. And we have also been taking account like the stone price indices, because we know that prices might be heterogeneous within food groups. So we adopted the stone price indices that actually helped us account for different weighting systems. Next slide, please. Now we have been facing some difficulties regarding the nature of the data we've been collecting. So sometimes we've been having the problem of individual commodities where actually permanent zero consumption and zero consumption at the time of the survey have been leading like to, in that case, is that some households have been reporting zero purchase or consumption. We also faced missing prices in our data set, but we used the nearest neighbor imputation models, where we basically replace the missing price by the average price at the lowest administrative, and so on and so forth. And another problem we faced was related to the zero consumption, and our model actually did not take that into account, and actually we had to apply some corrections. And what we did was a linear regression where consumption shares were dependent variables, and other characteristics such as the socioeconomic characteristics, prices, and total expenditures have been adopted as regressors. And then after imputing these missing or zero consumption shares, we rescaled our data and our shares so as to have 100%. So now I give the floor to my colleague Ami to move forward with descriptive results.
Thank you, Rasul. Now I will be presenting you the results that we obtained from this analysis. So Nefatu, you can show the other things. So in this first slide, Nefatu, I will be presenting the per capita annual consumption of the different types of rice that we have for both urban and rural households. Nefatu, you can show all the things. So this table shows three types of important results. The first one is that urban households consume more rice than rural households. This can be explained by the fact that in rural areas, there are other staples such as millet or sorghum that are also consumed by rural households. Also, the integration of rice in rural households' diet is rather something that is very recent, and it's still evolving. The second important result here is that rural households consume more imported rice compared to urban households who consume more local rice. So this can be explained by the fact that in rural areas in which households do not produce local rice, they have difficult access to local rice. And last but not least, the third important result here is that when we consider imported rice, broken rice is more consumed than whole grain rice for both urban and rural households. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, we have two figures. The figure one shows the expenditures on the different types of rice for different groups of households, income and spatial groups of households. We have quintiles 1 to 5 groups of incomes and rural and urban households. As we can see here, we have a rather linear pattern for rural households between expenditures and consumption for the different types of rice. For instance, we see that higher income groups tend to spend more on rice for all the different types of rice. However, when we look at the urban households, we don't see a linear pattern. The pattern is rather seem to be non-linear, even though we see that for local rice, richer groups, they seem to spend more on local rice. So the second figure here shows the share of the different types of rice in total rice expenditures. And what we see here, the main result is that households seem to spend relatively more on broken imported rice than any other types of rice. And this is more pronounced for rural households compared to urban households, where the differences are not that high. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we have the own price elasticities for both local and imported rice and for both urban and rural households. And when we look at the income elasticities, for instance, we see that 1% increase in income leads to an increase in the demand for both local and imported rice. And the increase is not negligible at all. And for rural households, it's almost 1% increase. When we consider the own price elasticities, they are all negative, and we see that when 1% increase in the price of local rice, for instance, leads to a decrease in the demand of local rice for both urban and rural areas. And this is also noted for imported rice, but the decrease is less than 1%, showing that these two types of households demand seem to be inelastic for both local and imported rice, and for both urban and rural households. Next slide, please. So here we have the cross price elasticities for uncompensated, well, for both urban and rural areas, and we have uncompensated, I haven't finished. And we have uncompensated cross price elasticities and compensated cross price elasticities. And here the main results, we have divergent results when considering the two types of cross price elasticities. For instance, when we consider the uncompensated cross price elasticities, we see that the two groups, local and imported rice, are rather weak complements for rural households, mainly. For urban households, the elasticities are not statistically significant. When we consider the compensated cross price elasticities, we see that these two local and imported rice are rather weak substitutes for both urban and rural households. So we have these divergent results. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we consider the results that we have related to the differences in rice consumption by location, the main policy recommendation here is that we need to improve local rice access for rural households through investments to increase production of good quality rice and also develop local value chains. And the results also show that the rice categories should be taken into account when designing policies for the rice sector. And the results on the substitutability of the different products and also on own price elasticities. Next slide, please. Yes, Leifatu. So the results on the price elasticity, Leifatu, next slide, please. The results on price elasticities, next slide, please, sorry. The results on price elasticities show that the price policies like subsidies or taxes may not be good shifters of demand for domestic rice. However, rising incomes or increased urbanization are more likely to accelerate the shift. So this study has some limits, and they are mainly the three that are listed here. For instance, we did not include detailed preference information due to data availability. Also, we don't have disaggregated, we did not do a disaggregated analysis of the different rice categories, which is important, but we did not have enough. We had low proportion of consumption for the different categories in our data set, so it was not possible. And also we underestimated own consumed rice by not including irrigated rice farm households. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ami and Rasul and Fatou. That was another outstanding presentation. And again, modeling fantastic time management skills. I'm quite impressed by these teams. So our third presentation will come from the IDRM team, the Institute of Disaster Risk Management at Bardari University in Ethiopia. That is Burhan Demesi and Tesfalun Kasi. Over to you, Burhan. I think you're starting first, correct?
Thank you, Chris. Could you share the slides probably? I can't share.
Very good. Jim, do you have them or do you need me to put them up?
The PPT format,
I can pull them up in 1 sec here.
Okay.
Burhan, perhaps you can introduce your team while we're waiting for Jim to get your slides up.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Just I am Burhan from Bahar Dar University, Ethiopia, and my colleague is Tasfahun here in Bahar Dar University, and other our mentors is from Cornell, Johan Apton, and Sylvia Blum. And just our title is just Climate Shocks and Resilience, Evidence from Rural Ethiopia. Just we have already just tried to address important policy relevant issues for probably in Ethiopia in terms of just the generalization and also the topic. I mean, just this is the title, and okay. Okay.
1 second.
Okay. Just our presentation has already 7 topics, 7 major issues. I'll present on 4 of them. The first 4 sections, and the first one will present the remaining 3 sections from section 5 to section 7. Probably it can't display the I don't know. Okay.
Burhan, if you just
try to share, yeah, Tasfahun, could you try to share? I can't share my phone.
Burhan, if you just ask Jim to advance slides, he can manage your slide presentation for you.
Yeah, exactly. So can you see the slides now just fine?
I can't see, yeah.
I'm sorry. Was that a yes? I had a hard time hearing you.
Okay, Tasfahun, could you share? Tasfahun may be able to share this.
Yes, I'm trying also from my phone.
Okay. So I'm on the introduction slide right now.
Yeah, just the introduction part, just this probably on the first one. The title is on climate shocks and resilience, which is evidence from rural Ethiopia. Just our mentors are Johan Apton and Sylvia Blum from Cornell. And also our presentation focus on the major points of our paper from, it has 7 sections. Okay, that's found is sharing. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank. Okay. Could you postpone, please, the next slide? Yeah.
I can only open the PDF.
I think it might still be easier just for me to do the sharing if rather than trying to do it on the phone. Just let me know when you want me to advance the slide.
Yeah, from the introduction part. Probably
okay, so now I'll be
yeah, this is just the outline is just on 7 sections. Just let's try to the first section. The first, this next one, the introduction part. I'll go to just jump to the introduction part, please. Just our motivation.
Birhan, forgive the interruption. I think we're all having a little difficulty hearing you. Can you perhaps move slightly closer to your microphone, please?
Yeah, is there a didn't hear?
That's a bit better, thank you.
Yeah, next slide, please, James. Our motivation is just Ethiopia rural households are exposed to climate shock, primarily drought is a major shock. And probably the major reasons or the causes is related with high dependence on climate sensitive livelihoods and also low level of resilience. Probably this problem is just a policy agenda starting probably from the 2015-16 El Nino industry drought, which is one of the worst drought in the history of the country. From that time, the climate shocks become a policy agenda, and also training resilience, household resilience is another major focus here. Next slide, please. Therefore, just in spite of the urgency of the problem, studies, policy relevant studies on the impact of climate shocks and the potential of resilience are limited in Ethiopia, especially even in sub-Saharan Africa. Probably studies on climate shocks, on climate impact shocks are conducted in homogeneous areas, or probably that cannot able to generalize at national level. And also there is lack of shock intensity in detail, and also even the shock response, household response to shock is not clearly pointed out. This is one major limitation on the first topic. Next slide, please. The other one is on the resilience part. Probably just this is a worldwide, just probably I think major issues on resilience. Despite the importance of resilience as a research topic and a policy narrative issue, most of the studies on resilience are just probably on methods unable to try to reconcile probably there's difference in terms of operationalizing the concept and also the way to operationalize the concept. And the most visible one probably is the debate and the distinction between resilience methods on framing their research questions. The most probably common one is just framing resilience as a right-hand side variable or left-hand side variable. These are the major probably issues. Among the widely applied resilience methods, resilience as a capacity and resilience as a normative condition are the most common one that frame resilience differently. Probably the first one is the resilience as a capacity method. Most of the time uses realized well-being indicators as a left-hand side variable and also try to explain variations in such realizations using the variations in the capacity indicators, while the resilience as a normative condition frame resilience in the left-hand side and try to explain the variations on these resilience indicators. Probably these two widely applied methods just agree on the definition of resilience. That is probably in a response to shocks. That resilience as a capacity that ensures stressors and shocks do not have long-lasting impact. But this capacity just relates with the attributes. We call them attributes, some call them indicators, some call them characteristics, some call them features. Despite this one, most of the literature on this issue, this resilience attributes or indicators are not clearly pointed out which resilience attributes are the most important one. Yes, this is our major research question. Next slide, please. Therefore, our motivation is just filling is this gap. Probably that the point that I already talked about. This one, the first one is the climate shocks. The second one is just the effective attribute identification, and also In doing so, we'll bridge or reconcile these popular resonance methods. Just this is our research gaps. Next slide, please. Just the major objectives related with this gap are just two objectives. One is to estimate the impact of climate shocks on household consumption. And also the second one is to identify the key attributes attributing the adverse impact of climate shocks on household consumption. These are the major objectives. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just here the variables, just the data and the variables. We just use national level data with climate data by joining household level and climate data at village level. The household level data is a nationally representative data from the Ethiopian Socioeconomic Survey. This is a third round survey. We use the third round. The major variables we used from these are two major variables, and probably the third one is the control variables, household well-being outcome and resilience attributes. And from the climate data, that is from other source, we just identify the major climate shock indicator variables. That is standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. I will talk more on this one. Next slide, please. Therefore, the major variables from we depend on or analyze are just the first one is our outcome variable, household consumption, measured in parallel equivalent at a national level on annually based on 2014 price at 2014 price, and also the resilience variables are just to show you the major one. Probably we just tested many variables, but these are some of the important ones. Next slide, please. Just the major shock indicators from that from our study here is just the objective measure of climate shocks. That is SCPI 6 standard precipitation index at 6 months level and at 6 months time scale and at 24 time scale. Just this is the index is based on just the major. The color indicates just the red one just indicates the major droughts in the country. Probably next slide, please. From the major climate indicators, just our difference is just constructing a dummy variable using linking consumption related with our objective measures of shock. Next slide, please. Just the two major methods. We have applied two major methods for the first objective and two even different methods for the second objective. For the first objective, we used two fixed effect models for the short-term drought and for the long-term drought. This is just the major variables and the equation. Probably next slide, please. Just for the second one, first, just we frame resilience as a capacity approach using the realized well-being outcome. Just this is the same model, but major objectives interact with this one. The next slide, please. This one is another that's the model. That's the second model. We just applied this model, but we made some modification for our purpose. That is we use a reduced form in order to just avoid a biting correlation between variables. Just using these variables, we already just addressed our objective. As found, we'll just continue the results and probably the implication part. Thank you very much. Yeah. Could you do as found?
Hello, everyone. I will present the results part.
you, Burhan.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hello. Hello.
Burhan, in the interest of time, I suggest you take over.
Yeah,
Hello?
yes, I can take over. Yes, probably if there is problem. Just
Okay.
this one is the result one major major.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I cannot be touch found, please. Probably there is an internet problem. The first model result is just the impact of shocks for the short-term
Hello?
down and long. Yeah.
Hello.
Touch found. We can't hear you. Just let me manage this one, please. Yeah.
Hello.
Just.
Burhan, please go ahead.
Yeah. Just this is the first result is this one for the short-term drought and the long-term drought. Despite just of course, both are just significant and negative in relation to our outcome variable. Of course, even the coefficients are almost the same, but we assume the implications for this short-term drought and long-term drought may differ. Therefore, in both ways, just these are the important climate shocks in Ethiopian context. This one is the first result. Probably, please next, please, James. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, this one is the other one. That's in terms of resilience, just framing resilience and identifying the major attributes from the models that I already described. Just this is the major results for realized consumption and for the probabilistic consumption. And some of the resilience attributes or resilience indicators are just significant or just imply for realized consumption and also some on the probabilistic consumption. But just due to our data limitations and also the nature of variables, some of the variables are just exploratory. One, just our assumption is just in order to identify the important attributes and also linking the two major widely applied resilience methods. Yes, this is our results one. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. There is a. Okay, just in terms of policy implication from our study, we just start from the gaps. Despite just the understanding of climate shocks as a major issue in Ethiopia, most of the previous studies not rigorously investigated in terms of just the time scale in relation to well-being outcome variables. Therefore, this is just from as a building up of previous studies. We just analyze the long-term and short-term implication of climate shocks on household consumption in Ethiopia. Second one is just resilience as a major variable. Sorry, just these are the implications. Resilience attributes as a major variables. Just next slide. Finally, just limitations for further study just include just the identification of major attributes or resilience pillars is very important, and for further study just is just a beginning to just link the major resilience. Thank you very much. Just sorry for the inconvenience connection. Just that due to our problem. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Burhan, especially for navigating through connectivity problems so gracefully. And Tesfahoon, we're sorry we didn't get to hear from you due to your connectivity challenges, but thank you for your contribution to that presentation as well. Just to reiterate what I posted in the Q&A, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A boxes. We'll come to those right after this last presentation, which is by Rehema Kahunde from the Economic Policy Research Center in Uganda. Over to you, Rehema.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone who is listening in. I hope you can see my screen.
We do indeed, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Rehema Kahunde. I'm presenting on behalf of the STAAARS team from the Economic Policy Research Center. Our paper is titled How Specific Resilience Mitigate the Impact of Drought on Food Security, Evidence from Uganda. The authors of this paper are Nathan Sunday, myself, Rehema Kahunde, and Blessing Atwine, with help from our mentors, that is Professor Soji and Professor Justine. In the presentation outline, I will be talking about, I'll show you a brief introduction of our study, and then the literature and the research gap or the contribution for our study, and then the approach or the methodology we used and the data sets, then the key findings, and then the recommendations from the findings. As part of the introduction, we see that drought is a global concern, and the World Health Organization in 2020 predicted or estimated about 55 million people who are affected by drought annually. In Africa, the problem is worse in the dryland areas, with about 14% of the people living in those areas affected by drought. So we see that this whole situation is even worsened by the current changes in climate, which is exhibited by the extreme weather conditions like the high temperatures. For the case of Uganda, drought has been cited as one of the most challenging climate hazards by the Food and Agriculture Organization, as it affects about 70% of Ugandans who rely on farm production for both food and livelihood. So the problem is even worse for those households with weak resilience capacities, as they are more likely to be affected by the adverse effects of drought. In this case, we note that building resilience is very critical or key if we're to ensure preparedness of these households for them to be able to recover and adapt to the effects of drought. More specifically, what we seek to answer, the main question we seek to answer in this study is, what is the most important resilience pillar in mitigating the impact of drought on food security in Uganda? We note that there is a growing body of literature on resilience and food security, both in Uganda and all over the world. People are studying resilience and food security, and most of them are following ideas from Alinovi and others, 2008 and 2010, where they estimate resilience as a latent variable. However, we note that one main characteristic of this, or one common feature of these previous studies, is that they mostly relied on cross-sectional data, and that is like a static approach to resilience analysis. And also, they do not consider the role of different resilience capacities. So they don't go into the details of the different pillars that make up resilience. So as a contribution of this study, we do account for temporal dynamics of resilience by using panel data. So we look at the evolution of resilience over the different waves of the panel data set we're using. We also consider the mitigating role played by the different resilience capacities and the specific components within each of these capacities, that is adaptive capacity, absorptive capacity, and transformative capacities, as laid out in the Tango framework. How we conceptualize the study, we see that a household that is faced by a shock, the shock here in this case is drought, the outcome is likely to be bad or good depending on the resilience capacities possessed by this household. Because with the resilience capacity that the household has, some coping mechanisms are activated in the event of a shock such as a drought. So some households may choose to do consumption smoothing, others may diversify their livelihoods in order to cope up with the adverse effects caused by the shock. So the way of methodology or the approach we're using, these are the two models we are estimating, where FS is a food security, and the RCI here is the resilience capacity index, the overall resilience capacity index in the first model here. So you can see the interactive term where we have resilience capacity index and drought. And this interactive term is trying to show us how it's going to enable us to know how resilience capacity index or the resilience capacity of a household mitigates the negative effects of drought on food security in a household. Then in the second model here, we bring in the different resilience capacities. So we break down the overall resilience capacity into absorptive, adaptive, and then transformative capacities. And also here, the interactive term where we have RC and DT here, BIT here. We're trying to show how it's going to enable us to show how each of these resilience capacities mitigates the impact of drought and food security. So in analyzing the two models, we use both pooled OLS and fixed effects estimation techniques. And to identify the components of each of these resilience capacities, the components of the resilience capacities, that is adaptive, the components of transformative, components of absorptive capacities, we use the Tango framework, which clearly states which components are under each of those resilience capacities. So here we use the two-step factor analysis, based on the three capacities, which I already mentioned. For the data that we are using, we employ, like I said, a panel data set, which is the Uganda National Panel Survey, which is a nationally representative panel data. We follow these 5 waves of that panel data set. So in this data set, households were asked if they had ever experienced drought in the 12 months before the surveys were conducted. So we noticed that there is a problem of self-reported incidence of drought, where a household may report that it experienced drought, yet it actually didn't. So for that matter, we use the SPAY data, which is the global scale SPAY data, to mitigate the bias that may arise from self-reported incidence of drought. We also note that attrition, the problem of attrition bias is very common with panel data sets. So here we re-estimate these models while controlling for the attrition hazard, which we computed by estimating the attrition function. And this approach is, of course, we followed Cheng and Trivedi in 2015. From the key findings, this is just a summary of the key findings from our analysis. After normalizing the resilience capacity index between 0 and 100, we noticed that the resilience capacity of households in Uganda is skewed towards the lower tile, that is between 0 to 50. That means most of these households are below the average of 50. So as you can see in the average resilience capacity index to the 30. The average here. So that means most of these households, majority of the households are below the 50% average. So this speaks to the susceptibility or vulnerability of Ugandan households to shocks, including drought. So with the skewness towards the lower tail also speaks a lot about the massive room that exists for increasing household resilience in Uganda. Also from our analysis, we note that there is high within and between variation through looking at the standard deviations of our analysis. So this speaks to the sustainability of the gains in resilience. So a household may be resilient today, and then the coming year, the household loses its resilience due to some time variant or time invariant variables or characteristics. So the between variation also speaks to the inequality of resilience across households, as we note in our dataset that households, especially those in the eastern and northern regions of Uganda, are more likely to be less resilient compared to households in the rest of the regions in the country. So the key findings, as we continue with the key findings, we see that from our analysis, drought undermines food security. And from what we computed, households that reported having been affected by drought were affected in terms of food security, as they were associated with a 22% reduction in per capita food consumption. So per capita food consumption and the number of meals per day are the measures we're using for food security. Yeah, so these households that experienced drought were more associated with a reduction in the per capita food consumption and the number of meals consumed per day compared to their counterparts that did not actually experience drought. Yeah, so also from analysis, we note that this impact diminishes with the duration. So as a drought, the onset of drought is really more dangerous to these households compared to the subsequent days after the shock has taken place. So also this speaks to the need to build ex-ante resilience rather than coming up with reactionary interventions, which in most cases may not help these households that have already been affected by drought. So the mitigating role of resilience here, resilience capacities, we see that those households with higher resilience capacity index are most likely to remain food secure in the event of drought. For example, from our analysis, we note that with every 1 point gain in resilience capacity index, there was an 8% increase in household per capita food consumption. So we conclude that a higher resilience capacity index mitigates the impact of drought on food security. So we can see here from our analysis, the 22% improvement in the 22% improvement in food security as the resilience capacity index increases for households. So looking at the regression analysis based on the 3 capacities, we see that different resilience capacities have different mitigating powers. So since we're our aim was to find out which capacity is very key in mitigating or playing a very key mitigating role on the impact of drought on food security, we see that adaptive capacity has the highest mitigating power, as we shall be seeing in the subsequent table, only that the numbers are not very clear. So we see that the adaptive capacity is the most outstanding compared to the transformative and absorptive capacities, respective of the measure of drought used. So under adaptive capacity, there are specific components that are very significant in playing that mitigating role, and that is mainly the access to information, specifically access to climate-related information, such that if these households had this information prior to the shock, probably they would be able to mitigate the negative impact of drought, and also linking social capital. Yeah, so those are the main key components under adaptive capacity. However, with even the other 2 capacities, that is transformative and absorptive capacities, we see that there are very key components that also matter when mitigating the negative effects of drought in different Ugandan households. So mainly under transformative capacity, access to better infrastructure services such as roads, education services was standing out as one of the components, the key components, and also access to extension services. These are patch extension services such as veterinary services. Then also access to communal resources such as communal land, communal forests, communal water bodies was also very key and absorptive under transformative capacity. And when we considered absorptive capacity, here we saw that the access to informal nets is the key component in playing the mitigating role of drought on food security. So these are the results here, as you can see under each of the different capacities: absorptive, transformative, and then adaptive. So from each of you can see in this lane, in the first lane under pooled or ALS, you can see that adaptive capacity was the most significant and even had the highest coefficient compared to the absorptive and then transformative capacity. From our findings, we recommend that there is need to invest in early warning systems and also enhance access to information. So like I said, access to information was one of the key components that was standing out. So in case these vulnerable households were able to access information such as climate-related information, this would be very important for them to mitigate the negative effects of droughts, as to prepare them to put in place mitigative measures. So also the need to support informal institutions. These informal institutions we're talking about are, for example, women groups belonging to church groups, those informal small institutions, as these were very key, as households reported that these were very key in mitigating the negative impacts of drought. In terms of those shocks, yes. So the other intervention we were suggesting was by way of government intervening in form of protecting or maintaining communally shared resources. Communally shared resources here, the communal lands in those societies where they have such, especially in cattle grazing areas, then also communal forests, communal water bodies, and also enhance access to the same communal resources by vulnerable groups, especially those in crop growing or livestock rearing areas. And the last recommendation is enhancing agriculture extension services, as this also as a key component on one of the capacities was also standing out. So this way, the government could ensure that at least every area or every parish has a veterinary doctor, for example, so that they can provide that required information in form of in terms of shocks such as drought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahema, for another excellent presentation. I just want to thank all four presenters, or all four groups, all four teams for outstanding presentations of very interesting research. We've had some active dialogue going on in the Q&A online. Let me just call attention to several of these questions. Rahema, if maybe I can direct a couple of these to you that have come in about the EPRC team's presentation. Martin Fowler asked two different questions. One is, it would be good to see a definition of drought as it is understood in Uganda to ensure there's no confusion in the minds of readers, participants in interpreting its incidents and analyzing the results. So perhaps you can, in a moment, say just a word to reiterate how you define drought, I think as a function of the STAAARS index. Second question Martin poses is, he quotes you saying, build ex-ante resilience. Can you please give some examples of the kinds of measures, policy measures, that households and the government of Uganda might take to do this? Thank you. Thank you for your questions, Martin. Rahema, do you have thoughts on explaining the drought measure and the policy implications? Rahema, can you hear us? Did you hear the question?
Yes, Chris. I got the question from Martin on is it the definition of drought?
Yes,
the definition.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, how we perceive drought in our study. This also, we are referring to the persistence in those dry conditions for a longer period of time. Dry conditions persisting for a longer period of time, beyond the normal period of time that a certain area or a certain community experiences those unfavorable climate conditions.
Very good. And I think, as Martin just acknowledged in Q&A, I think you already addressed his questions about policy implications in your last slide. So maybe we can turn to Burhan and Tesfahun's presentation from the IDRM team in Ethiopia. There's a question from Adani Lema from Bardar University. So one of your colleagues is interrogating you. I like this. He asks, how do you differentiate short-term and long-term drought? Burhan, do you want to explain?
Yeah, thank you very much, Adana and Chris. Just our major gap is short-term drought in terms of objective measures of drought based on standardized precipitation index, that is the updated one, based on the 6 months SCPI, based on the time scale. In terms of time scale, there are different categorization of drought. For instance, there are 6 based on 3 months, based on 6 months, based on 12 months, based on 24 months, and also even extra months, other extra months. Therefore, based on our just agricultural season, we just try to categorize droughts in terms of short term. That's probably our best prior to our dependent variable, 6 months prior to our dependent variable for the short term one. That is our outcome variable is collected on April to May. Therefore, our short-term drought will be prior to 6 months prior to the data the data already collected. Therefore, this is our classification of droughts, short-term and long-term drought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Burhan. I noticed that in the chat, so some of you may not have noticed in the chat box, there's an active dialogue that was going on in response to the BOM team's presentation on imported and domestic rice in Senegal. Fatou, would you like to just summarize for the broader audience who might not have the chance to see the chat dialogue, the issue that you and Dave Shirley were talking through?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Chris, thank you. So Dave asked us to elaborate on our conclusion regarding the fact that price policies may not be effective to increase rice demand, for local rice demand, for example. And we based this conclusion on our low price elasticity. That's what we said today. We found low price elasticities for rice and quite high income elasticities. And so price policies, in fact, may not be effective, while rising income may lead to increased local rice consumption. And again, he asked us what could be so the policy message. And what we can say is that here we can invest on communication campaigns, because in our descriptive statistics, we have seen that in towns where these communication campaigns were made, local rice is more consumed than imported rice. So this can be a good strategy to increase local rice consumption. And so they suggested also to talk about this in a 2-page policy brief, because it can be an important policy message.
Yeah,
so
I
this
want
is a summary of our discussions in the chat.
Thank you, Fatou. And I just want to endorse the good points Dave is raising there about the broader value chain. We oftentimes forget that there's something more than just the farmer and the consumer. Marcel, there's also an exchange between you and Dave in the chat that I don't think is visible to all the attendees. Would you mind just summarizing some of the takeaways from your analysis, the Africa School of Economics team's analysis using this geometric method on productivity and heterogeneity in Tanzania?
Sure, thank you, Chris. So with David, we were discussing the main implication of the paper, and mainly the main goal of the paper. And as I was saying, the main goal of the paper, the first goal of the paper was to provide a rigorous measure of productivity. And then since we run the regression trying to find out the features that help explain productivity, we have some significant coefficients that are in alignment with what the literature shows us. But still, we also have some coefficients that really are not in the direction with what the literature has been teaching us. So, for instance, taking the erosion problem, for instance, we found that although the coefficient is not significant, it is positive, but we would have expected a negative sign as the direction of this coefficient, for instance. So we're still thinking about what we learn from this project, but sure, there may be many things to draw from. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Dave, did you have anything you wanted to add to either of these last couple of questions? Forgive me, I had summarized or invited the presenters to summarize your points from the chat, but maybe I should let you do so yourself.
No, I think that's fine, Chris. I think that's a good way to do it. Just I'm focusing and trying to draw out some of the policy implications that might emerge from some of these results, while not going, too far beyond what the empirical results allow, right? But I do think that several of the papers have some policy messages that really could be distilled and could be very relevant for policymakers. The basic one in Senegal about, you could make the point about the inefficiency and unsustainability of tariffs and price subsidies, which tend to be the first things that policymakers look at. Draw attention to, kind of social campaigns that, especially if there's other evidence that those can have some impact. And then, the old standby, though, which policymakers tend not to focus on, which is building up supply chain investments to reduce the cost of local rice reaching consumers, because you can show that there's demand for rice that not really being satisfied as well as it could be because of probably high costs in the system. So anyway, that's the clearest example, but I think a couple of the other papers also have some policy messages, which we may want to work with the team and at least some of the teams to kick out a couple 2-page policy briefs.
Yeah, and indeed, one of the core policy centers is EPRC in Uganda, and there was a question in the Q&A to Rehema from Yanyan Liu, one of the mentors for the ASE team. Yanyan asked whether RCI, the Resilience Capacities Index, might be endogenous, and you were drawing some policy conclusions about informal institutions and agricultural extension. Rehema, can you perhaps respond to Yanyan, and do you worry at all about the policy conclusions you're drawing based on the RCI's prospective endogeneity?
Thank you for that wonderful question about endogeneity. But in our analysis, by using the fixed effects estimators, we control for we believe we're controlling for the all-time invariant factors, which could cause the endogeneity bias. So that's what we're following as a form of avoiding the endogeneity bias. Then I didn't get the second question.
It was really related to the policy implications you're drawing from RCI measures and unpacking them to very specific components like informal institutions or agricultural extension.
Or yeah, about the informal institutions, yes, from our analysis, we discovered that belonging to a certain institution, a certain informal institution, for example, a women's group or a church group or these community-based groups, was more likely to enable a household to be more resilient compared to a household that had members who did not belong to any of these groups. This could be attributed also to the fact that some of these group members are helpful in such times when households do experience these shocks. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Rehema. Well, I want to be respectful of people's time. I hope that all the attendees can appreciate what difficult topics these 4 teams have tackled and the skillful use they've made of both some of the best available current micro data as well as really good methods to tackle very interesting questions. I thank all 4 teams and their mentors for the outstanding work that they've done under the STAARS Plus program. I encourage all of you to look for these working papers as they begin to come out and make their way through the peer review process and into publication. It's been a real pleasure working with each of the 4 teams. I look forward to continuing our collaborations as we go forward, as you become STAARS alums. And encourage attendees to take a look at the request for proposals for the second cohort of STAARS Plus teams that one can find on the PRCI Innovation Lab website or on the Cornell STAARS website. Dave, do you have any closing things that you want to make to the audience?
Yeah, just thanking everybody again, thanking you, Chris, thanking the teams. And we know that the primary focus of this work was on rigorous technical analysis. That's very important. We're very thankful for that. In the cases where we think that there are empirically defensible policy messages that can come out of this, right? We will work with these teams to produce some policy briefs that your center will hopefully find useful in your engagement with policymakers out of this empirical research. So thanks very much again.
Thanks very much, everyone. Take care. Have a great day.